Hi everyone, welcome to this mini lecture. My name is Caroline, and today I would like to discuss with you about rheological measurement of suspension flow and if we can use two viscometers for that task, since there has been some debates about it. For that, I have this little agenda here, and which is basically an overview of this relevant topic developed in Poland's work that I just referenced here. So first, I will provide some definitions and context to our problem, show some trends, a laboratory experiment, and how we can overcome the gap existent between laboratory rheological measurements and real situations. To contextualize, we're going to focus on suspension flow, which sounds kind of familiar to us. As engineers, our chances to work in a process involving suspension is big, right? A suspension is basically solid particles dispersed in a fluid. At least is what we wish. We can also call it a slurry, and to understand the rheological behavior of a slurry is essential for mixing process or for transporting it to another facility, for example. Let's focus on this last application. Imagine that you aim to transport a slurry from operation 1 to plant 2, but instead of having a nice dispersed diluted slurry composed of fluid with fine particles, you actually have a high solid concentration slurry with particles of different sizes. This is a very common issue that we can encounter in real slurries. We know that we need a dispersing system to talk about any rheological measurements. So it seems obvious that those slurries containing coarse particles can be very challenging to characterize, if actually possible, right? We could even damage our equipment testing them. However, you don't have a choice, and you still have to design the pipeline system. But you suspect that the coarser particles present in the slurry may sink and stratify. How can we obtain any rheological data from the system? So before flowing forward, let's clarify a few terms by zooming in what is happening inside the pipeline. In this first scenario, you can observe the conveying fluid, also called sometimes the carrier fluid, and the suspension with fine particles and coarse particles form a nice dispersed system. The second scenario, you have a stratified suspension with two layers in which the coarser particles are likely to form a bed. We got more questions now about the system, because how coarse can be a particle to still be considered part of the fluid, the carrier fluid in this case? Can we assume that the coarser particles are not part of the fluid and then determine the rheological properties of the carrier fluid? Lots of questions, I know. To just show how challenging this can be, here's a comparison between the shear stress observed in a real pipeline and the results for some material tests in laboratory using a QAT flowmeter, rheometer, and a mini balance beam tube viscometer. We can observe a significant difference between them. Do you remember those two layers form that I showed in the previous slides? One corresponding to the bed formed by mostly coarse particles. So there are models called two-layer models to predict the suspension shear stress in a pipeline. And that's what this line refers to. Our main purpose here is to find a method to measure the rheology of the carrier fluid without being affected by the coarse particles. And we'll try the pipe viscometer. But before rushing to the lab, we still need a few more considerations. Here we have the same pipeline. In a two-layer model in which all solids form a bed, the fluid flow is only achieved when there is a pressure gradient across the pipe section that is enough to overcome the wall shear stress or resistant forces and the friction forces existing at the two-layer interface. In this graph over here, we're able to compare this pressure gradient I just introduced as a function of the pipe diameter. It basically shows the required pressure gradient changes for a non-Newtonian carrier fluid to flow above a stratified bed with 10 and 20% of solids by itself, and when we have a full suspension with 10 and 20% of solids. As shown, the forces required to move the fluid considering the stratified bed, it's only important for 70-millimeter diameter pipes or above, which means that below 70 millimeters, there is almost no significant difference in terms of force magnitude to move either the carrier fluid without solid particles or the suspension. Based on this idea that there is no pressure gradient difference for small diameter pipes, Fulham set this nice experiment, which is basically the tube rheometer we saw during week 3. As carrier fluid, they used a CMC solution and added glass beads, not so fine though, at 10 and 20% of solid concentrations. They took their measurements in 2 pipe diameters. For those who are not familiar with, CMC is just a modified polysaccharide. And here's what they got. Absolutely no significant distinction between the rheology of the carrier fluid without glass beads and with glass beads. They just proved their point, right? And this makes sense because both tuber rheometers have a diameter below 70 millimeters. However, if we go back to real data and use the 2-layer models to predict the carrier fluid rheology in a pipeline, we see again this difference comparing with the measured data. That means that the problem is not solved. Now I'm confused. How can we transfer and apply the rheological laboratory data for scaling up projects such as a pipeline, since the pressure gradient in the capillary rheometer with a very small diameter, right, does not discriminate between carrier fluid and suspensions? The authors then proposing the following steps, which I summarize here. But an extremely important point is that this work, if we assume that those stratified solids do not move within the pipe, which gives a lower yield stress value. Basically, we have to remove the overly coarse particles by screening, for example, and make sure that the capillary tube has an adequate diameter, remember below 17 millimeters in that case, and test your samples in different capillary viscometers, at least 2. So talking about summary, in today's mini lectures, that we learned that we may need to know the rheology of suspensions with coarse particles. And according to Fulham's work, we can do that using a capillary viscometer if we follow few assumptions. Don't forget about that. Overall, your sample has to be previously classified. Your capillary tubes used should be 10 times larger than the coarser particle diameter, and try to use at least 2 different capillary tubes. I know you probably want to skip for the next video, but I want to draw a few comments in those points. Thinking about a suspension with a wide particle size distribution with very fine particles or flock lengths added. Classifying some samples before the task can be very inconvenient in terms of time and also practical application. I can even change the rheological characteristics of my suspension before starting the measurements. Another limitation is that the authors consider the stratified solid layer static and the carrier fluid flowing on top of it. But we have to remember from week 3 class that these capillary pipe tests are performed under laminar conditions. Would that be the case in a pipeline? How would we account for the turbulence effect on coarser particles? Would the coarse particles be part of the carrier fluid in a more turbulent environment? More than complement this task with that two-layer model I talked a lot about. When you want to design a pipeline, you might want to consider to run a field laboratory test in a scaled down version of your pipeline to account for that turbulence. I know I started with a lot of questions, but I want you to take home more questions and maybe we can think of a solution together. Finally, this mini lecture was based on these two references in case you want to know more about this topic. Thank you very much for watching this video. See you next time.